Let's sit down at a medieval dinner table. Not the kind you see in movies, with kings feasting on golden plates and musicians playing softly in the background. I'm talking about a real table from the Middle Ages, a wooden plank on two barrels, maybe a rough bench to sit on, and a bowl of stew in front of you. There's a spoon, maybe a knife. Most of the time, you'll be using your hands. But there's one thing missing: a fork. Not because someone forgot to bring it, not because they're all in the wash. No, in most parts of Europe during the Middle Ages, people didn't use forks. In fact, the fork wasn't just unusual, it was seen as wrong, strange, suspicious, even sinful. Yes, really. For about 300 years, the fork was at the center of a quiet but powerful culture war across Europe. Some people thought it was fancy, others thought it was unnecessary, and many believed it was actually dangerous to your soul. But where did the fork come from in the first place? The idea of using a small tool to bring food to your mouth wasn't new. In ancient Greece, people used forks in cooking. In the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire, rich families sometimes ate with small, two-pronged forks. They weren't common, but they existed. Then, around the 10th or 11th century, forks started to appear in Italy, brought in by wealthy women who had married into European families from the East. There's one famous story from the year 1004. A princess from the Byzantine Empire married into a noble family in Venice. At her wedding feast, she brought out her own gold fork and began using it to eat her food. Guests were shocked. To them, using a fork was unnecessary and arrogant. One religious leader even said it was offensive to God, who gave humans fingers for eating. A few years later, the princess died of illness, and some people said it was God's punishment for using a fork. This kind of thinking lasted for generations. To eat with a fork was to say, "I'm better than you." It looked fancy, foreign, and worse, it looked like pride. In a time when religion shaped almost every part of life, being seen as prideful wasn't just rude, it was sinful. For a long time, forks were used only in small parts of Italy and in the Eastern Empire. In most of Europe, people kept using spoons, knives, and their hands. Forks were rare, strange, and often kept hidden in a drawer if you even owned one at all. So, why did this simple object, the fork, cause such a strong reaction? Why did it take centuries before it became something everyone uses today? That's the story we're about to tell. This is the tale of The Fork Was Illegal, a 300-year struggle between old traditions, new ideas, religion, fashion, and food. Over the next chapters, you'll learn how a small piece of cutlery changed the way people eat and how it fought its way from scandal to normal. But for now, keep your hands clean. We're just getting started. Before we dive deeper into the story of the fork, we need to understand how people ate before it showed up at the table. Because to most Europeans in the Middle Ages, the idea of not using your fingers to eat was like refusing to walk because shoes exist. It didn't make sense. It wasn't just normal, it was natural. In medieval Europe, meals were built around the hands. You were expected to eat neatly, yes, but using your fingers was completely accepted. In fact, there were rules about how to do it properly. You didn't grab food with your whole hand like a bear. You used 3 fingers for most foods, never all 5, unless absolutely necessary. Using your whole hand was seen as greedy or childish. There was even a proper way to hold meat. 1 finger under the bone, 2 on top, then tear off a bite-sized piece with your teeth. Clean, precise, practiced. The same went for bread, fruit, even cheese. You were expected to know how to handle your food with grace. If you were messy, it wasn't the food's fault, it was yours. And of course, people did use tools, just different ones. The knife was the star of the table. Everyone carried their own. It wasn't just for eating, it was part of daily life. You used it to cut meat, open packages, whittle sticks, or defend yourself if things got rough. At the table, it was how you carved off pieces of meat, sliced bread, or helped scoop stew. Your knife was personal. You didn't share it unless you really trusted someone. Spoons were also common. They were used for soups, stews, and poor digestible foods for rich and poor alike. But forks? hardly anyone even knew what they were. In most places, if someone had brought one out at dinner, it would have looked more like a medical tool than a utensil. People were used to the experience of food touching it, feeling its warmth or texture, judging its ripeness by hand. Eating was physical. And it wasn't just habit, it was tied to deeper ideas about life, religion, and nature. Many Christians in medieval Europe believed that the body was made by God, and so using your own hands to eat was not only practical, it was holy. There was even a phrase people repeated, "God gave us fingers for a reason." The hands were seen as honest toolshumen, humble, trustworthy. So when forks began to appear, they didn't just seem foreign, they seemed wrong. Think of it like this. If someone walked into a restaurant today and started eating spaghetti with metal chopsticks attached to a robot arm, people wouldn't just be confused, they'd be uncomfortable. It would seem weird, unnecessary, and maybe even rude. That's what forks felt like back then. The fork wasn't just new, it was challenging everything people believed about eating, manners, and morality. It was saying, your hands aren't good enough. And that was a message many people simply weren't ready to hear. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. The fork wasn't fighting spoons or knives. It was fighting the fingers. And the fingers had a 1,000-year head start. Our story now takes us to one of the first moments when Europe truly noticed the fork hand didn't like it. It's the year 1004, and Venice is celebrating a royal wedding. The city is glowing with light from 1,000 candles. The air smells of roasted meat and sweet wine. Nobles and church leaders sit at long tables covered in silk and gold-trimmed plates. Everyone's watching the bride, a beautiful young woman from Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Her name is Maria Argyropoulina, a Byzantine princess from one of the most powerful families in the Eastern Empire. She is elegant, educated, graceful. She wears gowns most Venetians have never seen before, embroidered with fine thread and precious stones. She is what we might call a trendsetter. But it's not her dress or her jewelry that makes people stare that night. It's what she pulls out at dinner. As servants place platters of food in front of her, Maria reaches into a small velvet pouch and takes out a strange objecta golden fork. Thin, delicate, with two sharp prongs, it glints in the candlelight as she uses it to pick up pieces of fruit and soft bits of meat, lifting them to her mouth without ever touching them. At first, the room goes quiet. People glance at one another, unsure how to respond. Then come the whispers, nervous laughter, side comments in Latin. The idea of using a tool instead of fingers to eat food? That wasn't just strange, it was insulting. As if her hands were too clean, too holy, to touch what everyone else had no problem handling. And the church was not amused. One priest reportedly said her use of the fork showed excessive pride, a sin in Christian teaching. Others claimed it was unnatural. A few whispered that the fork looked like the devil's pitchfork, which, let's be honest, didn't help its reputation. And then something happened that seemed to confirm their fears. Shortly after the wedding, Princess Maria fell ill. Within a few years, she was dead. The illness may have been natural, but many in Venice believed otherwise. They saw it as a punishment from God, not for wealth, not for power, but for daring to use a fork. The lesson was clear. The fork was foreign. It was arrogant. It was wrong. If a noblewoman from one of the richest empires in the world couldn't use it safely, then who could? For a long time after, this moment haunted Europe. Stories of the sinful princess and her golden fork were passed down as warnings. Travelers from the East who used forks were watched closely. Those who brought them to the table were seen as proud, vain, or worse, ungodly. And so, the fork, for all its shine and usefulness, became a symbol of danger, not because it hurt anyone, not because it failed, but because it made people uncomfortable. It broke the rules. It challenged tradition. That wedding in Venice didn't just introduce a new eating tool, it introduced a scandal. And Europe would spend the next 3 centuries trying to figure out what to do with it. By now, the fork had a reputation and not a good one. In parts of Europe, especially in the West, it wasn't just seen as foreign or odd. It was something darker. In the minds of many, this small two-pronged tool began to take on almost a sinister meaning. Some even called it the devil's toothpick. Why? Because in medieval Europe, everyday life was deeply connected to religion. People saw signs of Godin the devil in nearly everything. Illness wasn't just a medical issue, it might be a punishment. Strange weather wasn't just nature, it might be a warning. And a strange object that looked like a miniature pitchfork being used in place of your God-given hands, that was suspicious at best and evil at worst. Church leaders spoke out against forks. One famous religious scholar even wrote that using a fork was a sign of moral weakness, that it meant you were too proud to touch the food God gave you. Humble people used their fingers. Only those filled with pride would dare bring a piece of gold or silver between themselves and their food. And pride, in the Christian world at the time, was no small thing. It was one of the 7 deadly sins. That meant the fork wasn't just odd, it was sinful. Let's take a closer look at that fear. Think about what a fork does. It stabs. It pierces. It replaces touch with distance. It removes the eater from the food. In a world where physical closeness to the earth, to nature, and to your food was considered part of being human and part of being faithful, the fork seemed cold, mechanical, even inhuman. Some even went so far as to say that using a fork made a person less grateful for their meal, as if using your fingers was part of showing thanks to God. Hands were warm, alive, personal. A fork was metal, sharp, unfeeling. It also didn't help that most forks at the time came from the East Byzantium, Persia, and the Islamic world. In a time of tension between Christian Europe and its neighbors, this foreign origin only made the fork more suspicious. And remember, the idea of cleanliness wasn't the same back then. Today, we might think using a fork is cleaner than using your hands. But in the Middle Ages, cleanliness was more about spiritual purity than germs. A person could be covered in dirt and still be considered clean if their soul was pure. So, using a fork to avoid touching food didn't make you more proper, it made you look too proper, too proud, too distant from the rest of humanity. Of course, not everyone thought this way. In places like parts of Italy or the Eastern Empire, forks quietly continued to appear at upper-class tables. Some wealthy women used small forks to eat sticky or messy foods like candied fruits without getting their fingers dirty. But they usually did it in private, or with other nobles who wouldn't judge them for it. Still, the fear lingered. The fork wasn't trusted. It was a symbol of arrogance, excess, and dangerous change. It would take more than a few sticky fingers to change people's minds. For now, the fork remained in the shadows, useful, yes, but unwelcome. Its battle for acceptance had only just begun. While much of Europe still saw the fork as prideful, foreign, or even sinful, there was one place quietly making room for it at the dinner table: Italy. It started slowly. Forks didn't suddenly become normal across the country, but in the wealthier cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome, some people, especially among the upper class, began to use them. Not loudly, not every day, but carefully, quietly, thoughtfully. They weren't doing it to rebel, they were doing it for practical reasons. You see, Italian food in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance was changing. It wasn't just big chunks of meat and bread anymore. Italian cooks were creating more delicate dishes, soft cheeses, boiled vegetables, sweet preserves, honeyed fruits. These were sticky, slippery, hard to handle without a mess. And suddenly, using just your fingers didn't seem quite so elegant. Enter the fork. It made eating these foods easier, cleaner, and yes, more refined. For the Italians who adopted it, the fork wasn't a symbol of pride. It was a tool, just like a spoon, just like a knife. But they still had to be careful. The church was still powerful. Opinions didn't change overnight. Some priests warned against the fork, saying it distanced people from God's gifts. Others simply found it strange and unnecessary. So those who used forks didn't advertise it. Often, Forks were only brought out at private dinners among nobles or intellectuals, people who were used to new ideas and less likely to shout sin at the sight of new silverware. Still, Italy slowly became a safe space for forks. In some homes, especially among the nobility, small forks made of silver or gold began appearing in table settings. Some were beautifully crafted, engraved, polished, and expensive. They weren't mass-produced. Each one was made by hand and treated like a luxury item. But this luxury wasn't just for show. In many ways, the fork became part of a wider movement in Italian culture, a shift toward grace and control. This was the beginning of the Renaissance. Italy was full of new thinking art, science, architecture, and yes, etiquette. How you sat, how you spoke, and how you ate all began to matter more. It wasn't just about filling your belly anymore. It was about behaving in a way that showed education, calm, and respect. The fork fit into this new world perfectly. It kept your fingers clean, your gestures neat, and your clothes unstained. It made meals smoother, more beautiful, more civilized. And while many outside Italy still saw forks as strange, Italy was setting the stage for a much bigger change. Soon, a generation of travelers and thinkers would carry these new habits to other parts of Europe. Not everyone would welcome them, but the quiet fork revolution had begun. In Italy, at least, the fork was no longer a threat. It was a sign of progress. By the 1400s, something big was happening in Europe. People were starting to look at the world differently. Artists were painting more realistically. Scientists were asking bold questions. Architects were designing buildings that seemed to touch the sky. This was the Renaissance, a period of incredible change and curiosity, and with it came changes in how people lived, including how they ate. And that's where the fork started making its next move. Remember, Italy had quietly accepted the fork, especially among the rich and educated, but the rest of Europe, still suspicious. Still stuck on the idea that using a fork was either strange, sinful, or silly. That didn't stop the Renaissance from spreading. As scholars, nobles, and travelers moved between cities and countries, they carried more than books and ideas. They carried habits. And if you had spent time in an Italian court, you probably came home with a few new ones, like wearing more fitted clothes, speaking with polished manners, or eating with a small, elegant tool that lifted your food without staining your fingers. But not everyone was ready. Take France, for example. French culture was proud, deeply rooted in tradition, and quick to mock anything that seemed too Italian. French nobles who came back from Italy and started using forks at banquets were sometimes laughed at, even insulted. Using a fork made you look fussy, weak, or vain. There were even reports of guests being asked to leave if they brought their own fork to dinner. One noble wrote in a letter that forks were an affectation, something only show-offs or foreigners would bother with. In Germany, the fork was still mostly unknown. In England, it was barely mentioned at all. People still relied on knives, spoons, and hands, especially for meat and bread. Even the idea of needing a separate tool for eating seemed overly complicated. Why not just use what God gave you, many would say. But slowly, things started to shift because the fork kept showing up. It showed up at royal courts, brought by Italian brides who married into foreign families. It showed up in merchant homes, brought back from trade trips. It showed up in books on manners and cooking, written by Renaissance thinkers who believed that how you acted at the table reflected who you were as a person. A fork didn't just lift your food, it lifted your image. And that, slowly but surely, started to matter more. Around this time, eating itself was changing. Meals were becoming more organized. Instead of everyone reaching for the same dish in the center of the table, people began to receive their own plates. Food was served in course its own dish at a time rather than all at once. Formality became fashionable, and the fork, quiet and polite, fit the mood. Still, resistance held strong. One Renaissance writer joked that forks were for people who wanted to fight with their dinner. Others saw them as useless decorations, better suited for cake cutting than real meals. But slowly, year by year, table by table, the fork was carving out a place for itself. And while many still refused to use it in public, more and more Europeans were beginning to try it at home just to see what the fuss was about. A quiet war was turning into a slow invasion. The fork had reached the edge of the map, and now it was heading north. By the early 1600s, forks were quietly spreading through Europe, especially among the noble classes. In Italy, they were already accepted. In France, people were beginning to warm up to them. Even in parts of Germany, the fork was no longer shocking. But in England, the answer was still a firm no. To many English men and women of the time, using a fork seemed pointless, maybe even unmanly. The fork was viewed as a foreign oddity, an overcomplicated tool that tried to fix something that wasn't broken. After all, what was wrong with a knife, a spoon, and your own two hands? Let's look at what a typical English meal looked like in the early 1600s. You sat at a long wooden table, often with other people. Food was served in large shared dishes. You'd use your knife to cut meat and your fingers to eat most things. If something was runny, like soup or stew, you used a spoon. Otherwise, your hands did the work. Simple, direct, effective. That's what made the fork feel so strange. It was seen as slow, awkward, a little too polite. English culture at the time admired strength and simplicity, not delicate movements or fussy habits. So when someone showed up with a fork, the room noticed it, not in a good way. And then along came Thomas Coriat. In 1608, Thomas Coriat was a well-traveled Englishman with a curious mind. He spent time in Italy, where he saw people eating with forks, not just nobles, but regular people in certain cities. He thought it was interesting and practical, so he brought the idea back to England. In 1611, he published a book called Coriat's Crudities, where he described many things he had seen during his travels, including the fork. He wrote, "The Italian, and also most strangers that are cormorant in Italy, do always at their meals use a little fork when they eat their meat. I myself thought it very good to imitate the Italian fashion." The response? Mockery. His friends at court gave him the nickname Furcifer, which means fork bearer, and it wasn't a compliment. They teased him. They laughed at him. And even years later, the story of that man who used a fork stuck around like a bad joke. Still, Coriat had planted a seed. Because even though people made fun of him, some were quietly listening. His travel book became popular. Other nobles traveled to Italy and saw forks in use. Some women, especially those who wanted to appear fashionable, began to try forks in private. And at very elite dinners, forks started to appear at the table, not used by everyone, but present. Change was slow and often met with resistance, but it was happening. Even Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled before Coriat's time, reportedly had forks in her collection gifts from abroad. Did she use them? Probably not often, but they were there. By the mid-1600s, forks were starting to show up in upper-class English homes, not just as decorations but as actual utensils. Still, it would be many more decades before they became common, and even longer before the average English family saw one at the table. England, proud of its traditions and suspicious of foreign trends, had resisted the fork harder than most. But thanks to travel, trade, and one very determined writer with a fork in his hand, the walls were beginning to crack. The fork had survived the laughter, and it wasn't leaving. While England mocked and delayed, France, after years of hesitation, began to change its mind. Not all at once, not loudly, but by the late 1600s, something was shifting in French culture, and it all started with the same thing that made France famous today: style. The French elite were obsessed with elegance. Fashion, manners, music, language, everything had to be beautiful, polished, and graceful. You didn't just eat food, you performed it. You didn't just dine, you dined properly. And slowly but surely, the fork became part of that performance. Of course, France didn't welcome the fork with open arms at first. Back in the 1500s, many still mocked it as an unnecessary tool. Writers described it as something for vain and soft men, people who didn't want to get their fingers dirty. Forks were linked with foreigners, especially Italians, and not everyone liked the idea of bringing foreign habits to the French table. But the problem was Italians kept showing up, literally. Many royal marriages connected French nobles with Italian families, and the most famous of these unions was between Catherine de' Medici and King Henry II of France. Catherine, a member of the powerful Medici family from Florence, arrived in France in the 1500s with a team of cooks, artists, and advisors and, yes, a collection of fine silverware, including forks. Now, did Catherine introduce the fork to France all by herself? Not exactly. That's a myth historians often debate. But what's true is that she used them. Her Italian-style table manners caught attention, both admiration and suspicion. She didn't just bring recipes and perfumes. She brought new expectations about how a noblewoman should behave at the table. It wasn't long before people around her started copying. Still, it took almost a century for forks to go from a curious foreign item to a regular part of elite dining. The turning point came during the reign of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, in the late 1600s. His court at Versailles was the center of fashion for all of Europe. If you wanted to be seen as elegant, important, or modern, you copied Louis, his style, his speech, even his table. Under Louis, court dining became an art. Food was served in courses, napkins were folded just so, and forks began appearing not just at royal banquets, but in manuals on etiquette. Books instructed nobles how to sit, how to cut meat, and how to use a fork without looking foolish. At first, forks were used for specific food-soft fruits, fish, anything that might drip or stain. But as their presence grew, they became more accepted for everyday eating. The older idea that hands are holier started to fade. Cleanliness, elegance, and manners took its place. And let's not forget fashion. French forks were often made of silver, carved beautifully, and matched the rest of a noble's table setting. A well-set table became a symbol of wealth and culture. The fork wasn't just a utensil, it was a statement. By the end of the 1600s, among France's elite, using a fork no longer looked proud or sinful. It looked chic. The rest of the population still using fingers, knives, and spoons. But as always, change starts at the top. And with France now on board, the fork's journey across Europe was speeding up. The war was far from over, but the fork had just won one of its biggest battles. By now, the fork had slipped into the hands of Europe's rich and powerful. But it hadn't just become a tool for eating. Nobi, the 1700s, the fork had become something much more than cutlery. It had become a symbol of control. In royal courts, where appearances meant everything, the fork wasn't just about manners or hygiene, it was about power. Who had it, who didn't, and who was trying to climb their way to the top by learning how to use it properly. Let's return for a moment to Versailles, the palace of King Louis XIV in France. At his court, no detail was too small. The way you bowed, the way you spoke, and yes, even the way you ate all of it, was part of your public image. People watched, people judged. If you used your fork awkwardly or held it the wrong way, it wasn't just embarrassing, it could hurt your status. In this world, eating became performance. Nobles practiced how to cut meat without scraping their plates. They learned how to take small, delicate bites. Forks were held gently, with the right fingers at the right angle. No stabbing, no slouching, no slurping. To eat like royalty, you had to look like royalty. And as court behavior spread to the rising middle classes, merchants, bankers, and educated professionals, the fork came with it. These new wealthy families wanted to prove they belonged among the upper class. They copied noble fashion, noble speech, and noble table manners. But here's the twist. While the fork was becoming more popular, It was also creating new problems, especially for those caught between worlds. Imagine being a young man invited to dine with a noble family. You've worked hard, you've dressed well, you've read the books, but now you're at the table, and everyone is using forks like they were born holding them. You, on the other hand, aren't sure which hand to hold it in, or whether to switch your knife and fork between bites, or what to do if you drop it. One wrong move, and you're exposed. The fork had become a quiet test, a way to separate the refined from the rough. Even etiquette books from this time started focusing on fork use. They gave instructions like, never stab your food with a fork. Do not wave your fork when speaking. Always cut small pieces before eating. Never bite from a large piece. These rules weren't just about neatness, they were about control, status, and appearing civilized. In England, France, and parts of Germany, the fork was now firmly part of high society. And in countries still warming up to it, using a fork became a quiet way to show off, to say, look at me, I know how to behave. I've been educated. I belong. But for millions of regular people, farmers, laborers, townsfolk, forks were still out of reach. They were expensive, hard to find, unnecessary for a life that didn't involve 5-course meals or gold-rimmed plates. So now the fork wasn't just a foreign object. It was a class divide, a line on the table between those who had power and those who didn't. The fork had started as a scandal. Now it was a signal. And it still wasn't done changing Europe. By the early 1700s, something important was happening across Europe. Cities were growing, trade was expanding, education was spreading. And for the first time in history, a true middle class was starting to form. These weren't nobles with castles or peasants working the fields. They were merchants, shopkeepers, lawyers, teachers, and craftsmen, people with some money, some education, and a strong desire to move up in the world. And if you wanted to rise in society during this time, you had to do more than just earn money. You had to look the part. You had to act refined, speak properly, dress smartly, and yes, you had to eat like someone who belonged, which meant, whether you liked it or not, you needed to learn how to use a fork. By now, the fork had already been accepted among Europe's noble families. It was expected at royal banquets and fashionable dinner parties. But for the middle class, it was still new and a little intimidating. Many people weren't sure how to use it. Which hand should hold the fork? Do you switch it with the knife? Is it only for fancy foods, or do you use it for bread too? Is it rude to use your fingers now? This uncertainty led to the rise of a whole new trend: table manners books. These were little guidebooks full of rules about how to behave at the table. They were written in simple language and sold cheaply, which made them perfect for the middle class. Some titles included The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, A Gentleman's Guide to Proper Dining, Conduct at Table for Young Ladies. These books didn't just explain how to hold a fork, they explained what the fork meant. Using one correctly showed you were calm, disciplined, and well-mannered. People who fumbled or ignored the fork risked looking wild or ignorant. In some homes, parents began teaching their children to use forks from a young age. It wasn't just about eating, it was about building a better future. Knowing how to handle yourself at the table could open doors, social, romantic, even professional. A neat eater was seen as a trustworthy person. A messy one might lose an opportunity. The middle class took this seriously. And so, forks began showing up in more and more homes, not gold or silver ones like the nobles used, but simpler versions made of iron or tin. Still, they worked. And for many, they were a symbol of success. If you had a fork at home, you were doing well. If you used it properly, you were going places. Of course, not everyone loved the change. Older generations sometimes rolled their eyes. Back in my day, they might say, we ate with our hands and didn't need any of this nonsense. But the younger crowd, the ambitious ones, they were all in. Because to them, the fork wasn't just a utensil. It was a ladder. A small, shining step towards something better. And in living rooms and kitchens across Europe, quiet revolutions were taking place one forkful at a time. By the mid-1700s and into the 1800s, the fork had finally made peace with Europe's upper and middle classes. It had fought its long, strange war and was starting to win. But now, something much bigger was coming, something that would change not just who could use a fork, but how forks were made, sold, and seen. That something was the Industrial Revolution. Factories were rising. Machines were replacing hand tools. Workers were moving from farms to cities. Products that once had to be made by hand slowly and carefully could now be produced by the thousands in a single day. And for the fork, that changed everything. Before this time, forks were expensive. They had to be handcrafted by metalworkers. Most were made from silver, brass, or pewter. Owning a fork was a sign of wealth. Even the middle class, eager as they were, often had just one or two for special occasions. But now, with industrial machines and mass production, forks became affordable. Factories in cities like Birmingham, Sheffield, and Solingen started churning out cutlery forks, knives, spoons by the barrel. Materials like steel and nickel silver, a cheaper silver-colored alloy, made it possible to sell forks at prices most families could afford. Suddenly, forks were no longer a luxury. They were a household item. A family might own an entire matching set. Children were raised using them. Servants were expected to clean and polish them. Schools taught proper table manners. What had once been strange or foreign was now completely normal. But along with availability came standardization. Before mass production, forks came in all shapes and styles. 2 prongs, 3 prongs, curved handles, flat tips. There was no real rule. But in the factory, designs had to be consistent. And so, the now familiar 4-pronged fork became the most common. It was strong. It held food well. It worked with most types of dishes. And thanks to machines, it could be produced in endless numbers and shipped across continents. By the early 1800s, forks were appearing everywhere, in working-class homes, taverns, ships, inns, hospitals, and schools. In just a few decades, the fork went from rare to routine. In a way, the fork's long struggle was finally over. But with mass production came something new: style for the masses. Companies didn't just make forks, they made fashionable forks. Catalogs offered patterns with names like Rose Bloom and Imperial Twist. Forks were sold in velvet-lined boxes. Some families had special forks for guests, and plainer ones for everyday use. Even though they were cheaper now, forks still carried a sense of pride. Owning a full set meant you were clean, organized, and respectable. It meant your family belonged to the modern world. A drawer full of shiny forks meant you weren't just surviving, you were keeping up. In many ways, the Industrial Revolution didn't just help the fork win. It helped the fork disappear into the background. No longer controversial, no longer foreign, no longer feared. Just there, a quiet, trusted part of daily life. And yet, few people remembered that not so long ago, this little tool had once been seen as dangerous. A devil's toothpick, a prideful invention, a symbol of sin. Now, it was just the fork, and it was here to stay. By the time the 1800s were in full swing, Europe had mostly accepted the fork. It had gone from scandal to status, from status to standard. But across the ocean, in a young and growing nation called the United States of America, the fork's journey was still unfolding. At first, American dining looked a lot like English dining from a century earlier. People mostly ate with knives, spoons, and fingers. The fork was known, but it wasn't always used. In some homes, it was reserved for fancy guests. In others, it was seen as too European, too delicate, or just unnecessary. But just like in Europe, American ideas about eating were changing. By the early 1800s, American cities were growing fast. Trade was booming. More and more Americans had access to goods from abroad, including books, fashion, and you guessed it, cutlery. Forks became easier to buy, especially as factories in the US began to make them cheaply and in large numbers. One of the most important early centers of American cutlery production was Sheffield, Massachusetts, and later Meriden, Connecticut. These places became famous for high-quality silverware that middle-class families could afford. Forks became part of wedding gifts, holiday meals, and household pride. But still, the fork didn't spread everywhere at once. In rural areas, people often stuck to the old ways. Farmers and frontier families ate quickly, often from a single pot. Time was short, and food was practical. You didn't need a fork to eat beans, corn, or boiled meat. You just needed a good spoon and a sharp knife. A fork felt fancy, maybe even un-American to some. But cities were different. In places like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, forks were becoming part of the middle-class dream. Families wanted to show they were modern and respectable. They copied upper-class habits. They followed advice from etiquette books and household guides, many of them written by women who became the first influencers of American domestic life. One of the most famous was Catherine Beecher, who co-wrote The American Woman's Home with her sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Yes, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In their book, they included instructions for setting the table, serving meals, and how to use a fork properly. By the late 1800s, American families weren't just using forks. They were using different forks for different foods. A fork for meat, a fork for salad, a fork for dessert. Forks had gone from rare to routine, and now they were multiplying. And guess what? Americans didn't just copy fork use from Europe. They adapted it. Unlike the traditional European continental style of eating where the fork stays in the left hand and the knife in the right, Americans developed what's now called the zigzag style. Cut with the knife in the right hand, then switch the fork to the right hand to eat. It was slower, but considered more refined in American dining rooms. It's still the most common way Americans eat today. So, while the fork may have started in ancient Persia, made its way through Byzantium and Italy, and sparked a cultural war in Europe, it settled quietly into American life in its own way. And once it did, it never left. By the end of the 19th century, the fork had become just as American as the rocking chair and the apple pie. It had crossed oceans, cultures, and centuries, not as a weapon of pride or scandal anymore, but as a trusted tool, an everyday object, a sign that finally the battle was over. Or was it? Because next, the fork would do something no one expected. It would go global. By the early 20th century, the fork had become a firm part of daily life across Europe and North America. It had gone from scandal to standard, from a symbol of arrogance to an everyday tool. But now it faced its next great challenge, not from religion or royalty, but from other cultures with their own ancient ways of eating. Because while the fork had won over the West, it was still just one way to eat. Let's head east. In places like China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, forks weren't common not because they were feared or rejected like in medieval Europe, but because these cultures already had something they preferred: chopsticks. Chopsticks had been used in Asia for over 20 years. They weren't seen as fancy or controversial, they were normal, just like fingers or spoons. In China, Confucian teachings encouraged peaceful, graceful table manners, and chopsticks fit that perfectly. They didn't stab, they didn't slice. They lifted food gently, one bite at a time. In Japan, chopsticks were tied to ritual and respect. Certain foods required specific types of chopsticks, and meals were served with thoughtfulness and balance. In these cultures, the fork wasn't rejected for being sinful. It simply wasn't needed. But by the 19th and 20th centuries, Western nations, especially Britain, France, and later America, were expanding their power across the globe. With them came armies, traders, missionaries, and forks. European visitors often arrived in Asia, expecting everyone to eat the same way they did. In hotels, embassies, and schools, forks became part of the meal. In some cases, locals were encouraged or forced to use them in formal settings, especially when dealing with Western guests. Some missionaries even taught that proper manners included knife and fork use. But resistance wasn't hostile, it was practical. In many Asian cuisines, food is already served in small, bite-sized pieces. There's no need for cutting or stabbing. Rice is sticky enough to be picked up with chopsticks or scooped with a spoon. Soups are sipped directly from bowls. Stir-fries, dumplings, noodles, none of these required a fork. In fact, using one often made things harder. Even today, many people in Asia find fork use clumsy for their food, just as early Europeans once found forks clumsy for their meals. Still, forks slowly made their way into global homes, especially in cities and international schools. Travel increased, trade grew, cultures blended. And by the mid-20th century, it wasn't strange to see a fork on the same table as chopsticks or even to use both at different times. In places like Thailand, where spoons are the main utensil, forks are used to push food onto the spoon knot to lift it directly. In the Philippines, people combine forks and spoons in a completely different style, cutting with the edge of the spoon. So while the fork spread across the globe, it didn't replace other utensils. Instead, it learned to share the table. Today, walk through any major city from Tokyo to Paris, New York to Nairobi, and you'll see forks alongside chopsticks, spoons, and yes, still fingers, because eating isn't just about tools. It's about culture. The fork didn't conquer the world the way it had Europe. It didn't need to. It became one piece of a much larger, richer story. A sign that while our ways of eating may be different, we all sit at the same table. And sometimes, the fork gets to come along just in case. Today, the fork sits quietly in your drawer. It doesn't shout. It doesn't shock. It doesn't carry any sense of scandal or sin. You probably use it without thinking. Stab, scoop, twirl, done. But the truth is, this calm, ordinary tool carries centuries of history behind its smooth metal shape. And in becoming normal, the fork left behind a trail of stories that most people have forgotten. This chapter is about what the fork changed, what it erased, and what it taught us along the way. 1. It changed how we eat, literally. The fork didn't just slip into the meal quietly. It reshaped how food was prepared, served, and presented. Before forks became common, most food was designed to be eaten with fingers, spoons, or knives. Meat was served in large pieces to tear apart. Bread was the main tool for scooping sauces. Soups were central to many meals because they were easy to eat with a spoon. But once forks entered the picture, chefs adapted. Food began to be sliced in smaller, fork-friendly portions. Sauces became smoother to cling to bites. Even pasta was reshaped. Wide, flat noodles turned into long strands like spaghetti, which could be twirled. The fork didn't just join the meal. It redesigned it. 2. It redefined manners and class. As we've seen, forks weren't just about food, they were about status. For centuries, whether or not you used a fork and how you used it could say everything about your place in society. Forks created a silent pressure. Learn the rules or risk looking poor, ignorant, or impolite. This wasn't fair. Many people around the world ate just as neatly with their hands or other tools, but because fork use was seen as civilized, everything else was often viewed as less than. Cultures that didn't use forks were called barbaric or behind, not because of what they lacked, but because of what Europe valued. In other words, the fork didn't just lift food. Sometimes it lowered others. 3. It erased the hands. In the earliest days of the fork's rise, one of the strongest arguments against it was simple. God gave us fingers. For most of human history, eating with hands wasn't dirty. It was normal, and even spiritual. You could feel the temperature, texture, and softness of food. In many cultures, especially in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, eating with your hands is still seen as an intimate, respectful act. But as forks spread across Europe and North America, hands became something to hide. Finger eating was called primitive, dirty, embarrassing. The fork changed that attitude. It told people that Clean, correct eating required a tool. And for many, that idea stuck. 4. It sparked imitation and invention. The success of the fork helped create the modern cutlery set. Fork, knife, and spoon, lined up neatly at every meal. It also inspired specialization. Salad forks, fish forks, dessert forks, pickle forks, and even ice cream forks. Yes, that was real. In the 20th century, entire table settings became a kind of choreography. Every fork had its place. Every tool had its job. What started as a scandal became a system. And today, we still carry that influence. Even in casual settings, most people feel more proper when using cutlery. It's hard to imagine a formal dinner without a fork. 5. It survived us. Perhaps the most impressive thing about the fork is this: it survived everything. It survived religious backlash. It survived cultural resistance. It survived ridicule, fear, and war. And today, it has adapted to global life. It exists in diners and palaces, in school cafeterias and wedding banquets. It's made of plastic, gold, bamboo, titanium, and steel. It's disposable or engraved. It's used by toddlers and presidents. And after years of fighting for a place at the table, the fork has finally done the impossible. It has become invisible. So invisible, in fact, that we almost forgot it had to fight to be there at all.